We do not know what we are, or why we are, as a matter of being precise. We are alive and free-willed, but if we know the how that is, then we do not know the why. For all intents and purposes, the question of why we are conscious is one of the biggest unsolved mysteries in all of science. Many scientists have tried throughout the years and the decades and even the centuries even to deny that we are conscious because of how ill-equipped we are to justify that we are, and for no other reason. There's no scale with which to quantify what happens in the mind, and no way at all to describe our own consciousness without any sort of matter attached as quote-unquote scientific or as a data. And for the longest time, denying consciousness became the scientific standard. But we know this is not true. Every day we're alive, conscious, and free thinkers. So is everyone around us. It's something that we're only denying because we can't prove it in the harsh empirical standards of science. To reverse that and to find an acceptable definition, what does it mean to be conscious? Why do we have something that inhabits us in our five senses, something that feels stark and alive? Why aren't we zombies or robots that intake information and automatically respond? But rather, why do we get to do what we do with the information we intake at every moment? Why are we automated the way that we are, where we can think, feel, be original, and have our free will in response to everything? What do we call a sense of our own self, and why do we have it? Where does the mind separate from the matter, and what does it feel like when we're alive? What is this phenomenon that we call our own life? An important distinction about defining consciousness, to get to the heart of it, is to define what consciousness is not in this discussion. Consciousness is not defined as the state of being awake or alive or alert towards something. That's too general of a term. So it is instead something inside of us that does not go away when we are simply asleep. We're always conscious, yes? It is also, importantly, not consciousness in the sense that you have critical thinking skills. For example, take this pattern here. What shape will come next? The answer is something that you don't need me to specify for you. You just need an articulate critical thinking skill to deduce the next shape automatically and subconsciously, without the conscious. Critical thinking exists separately from the theory of consciousness. Even tougher thinking challenges, the phenomenon of intuition rears its head as the end of any arguments that you need to apply to consciousness to critical thinking. Moments of intuition are defined by when a solution, an insight, or an idea comes to you about a complex problem completely unprompted and without any conscious effort. Thinking without consciously applying yourself. The two are similar, and they often function together, but to be conscious is something wholly separate from being a sharp thinker. To be conscious, instead, is to be inside of yourself. To illustrate this point that it's difficult to separate critical thinking from consciousness, try to point to the part of yourself that is conscious. Is it your own brain? Or your eyes? Which part of your brain, then? What is it behind your eyes in particular? Which part of you is the you? There is no real answer to this question. We have some very loose leads as to which part of the brain it might be. For example, the function of the reticular formation. When it is deactivated, the individual is known to enter into a comatose state. Meanwhile, 1962 Nobel Prize winner Francis Crick and his partner in science, Christoph Koch, observed that there was a 35 to 75 hertz neural oscillation in the cerebral cortex that correlated to and responded to general awareness. These are sound enough, and they're good leads as to what in us is conscious, if either one is true. And yet, the question of how and why we are anything conscious at all still looms at large. In fact, we are so uncertain as to what makes you your own personality, your own thing, your own conscious responder to everything in the world that experiences the five senses, that it could be safe to say that your own consciousness exists outside of yourself. It could be some force on the back of your hand, or it could be floating off in the other room, or somewhere on the other side of the planet, powering you and your ideas and your sensory experiences, your free will, and your ability to perceive everything and react accordingly. Any of those could be true, and there would be no way to prove this, that you are conscious outside of your own body. It is odd that even then, the average person has the inclination to be almost offended by this idea. What is it inside of us that makes us us? Where do we even begin to look for the answers to one of the most unsolvable problems in the history of science? Well, one contemporary and revolutionary theory, while still new, radical, and in some ways unproven, could provide us with an excellent place to reevaluate our understanding of ourselves and what it means to be conscious. All we have in this field are highly educational guesses and theories about where our own consciousness comes from. Most of them thus far have had little basis in science, or at least not enough to sustain them with our current understanding of the world and the way it works. There is, however, one modern and fascinating theory of consciousness that radically alters the way that we look at life. But new though it is gaining rapid scientific approval in many biological circles: the theory of panpsychism. Panpsychism, the theory that all forms of matter are to some extent conscious, has two bold claims that at first seem absurd before they are elaborated on. The first concept is that conscious isn't something that is exclusive to biological life forms like animals, plants, fungi, bacteria, etc., but rather it is a basic building block of the universe, much like how every object is affected by space, time, gravity, light, and mass. Consciousness is a fundamental thought throughout nature as the cell or as the atom. The second bold claim is that every form of matter, even non-biological matter such as desks or rocks, have some semblance of consciousness at the molecular level. Everything, to a varying extent, is lightly conscious. Humans, animals, plants, fungi, bacteria, sure, as before mentioned, but even metal, buildings, trees, water, books, and individual molecules and atoms are conscious. The more complex a form of matter is, the more conscious it will become. From very microscopic, very light, very simple forms of consciousness in the atom and the cell, to average amounts of consciousness in moss and in plastics and in plants, to highly conscious, highly aware beings such as birds, primates, elephants, and humans, and potentially beyond. This is a theory that implies a lot of radical change to the way that we approach all matter and the way that we approach our understanding of the universe and all life. Burgeoning questions no doubt spring from this implication, if it's true at all. But a scientific explanation, more or less, for the validity of the human soul is hard to overlook. It might not be exactly that, but consciousness has been a hard problem that has eluded thinkers for as long as humans have been thinking. As soon as we have had an understanding of ourselves, we have had to ask why we are conscious. And this might be a good building block to start. Assuming that there is even minimal consciousness, awareness, and life at the molecular level, and that the more concretely it grows, the quote-unquote more conscious the organism becomes, this gives way to a large amount of new understandings in evolution of all kinds. Allow me at this time to debunk some popular misconceptions about the school-taught understanding of evolution before we come back to panpsychism as it pertains to it and to my work. Random new traits are not supposed to simply fall out of the sky. In order to grow an extra functional finger, an existing term known as polydactyly, the human body would need to develop, through chance evolution, according to the traditional Darwinist model of using Punnett squares and calculating genes, an extra set of bones, cartilage, muscle, tendons, skin, nerves, knuckles, a fingernail, and the same structure as the other 5 fingers, in the exact same order, and the exact same spot, merely duplicated a 6th time. All of that doesn't happen within one generation, which is why in humans, most cases of polydactyly are simply quote-unquote nubbins without any of the necessary components of a finger, just an extra piece of flesh. If this trait were to appear functionally on its own, it would be nothing short of a scientific miracle. So far, so good. However, when we consider that the giant panda is born with 6 fingers for no reason at all, the only explanation is that the evolution doesn't fall out of the sky based on slight chance mutations like we are taught, but instead it happens in larger quote-unquote chunks. Another example comes in the prenatal construction of the eyeball when mutated. According to Professor Waddington, when quoted through Arthur Koestler's Ghost in the Machine, there have always been, and there still are, reputable biologists who feel that such considerations make it doubtful whether random hereditary changes can provide a sufficient basis for evolution. But I believe that the difficulty largely disappears if one remembers that the organ, like the eye, is not simply a collection of elements, such as a retina, a lens, an iris, and so on, which are put together and happen to fit. The different parts instead influence one another. Several people have shown that if, by some experimental means, the retina and the eyeball are made larger than usual, then that in itself will cause a larger lens to appear, on its own completely, of at least approximately the appropriate size for vision. There is no reason, therefore, why a chance mutation should not affect the whole organ in a harmonious way. Meanwhile, on this note, just as of August 2021, many neuroscientists have discovered a disturbing phenomenon in which a brain organoid originating as a human cluster of stem cells evolved over 60 days in neurogenesis to have two optic cups as they are evolved. Essentially, this 60-day-old compound collection of stem cells developed on its own identical, symmetrical, and very primitive optic cups functioning as eyes that blink when exposed to light, and a completely non-sentient being. If evolution is random, it is weird that this recently conscious and recently born organoid has the same status quo standard of two eyes, same as any other organism, and for what reason we don't understand. The amount of consciousness originating from the small collection of stem cells is remarkable. The last example of evolution happening in strange, chunky, prearranged and predetermined ways comes from these illustrations from the 1917 descriptive science novel On Growth and Form by Darcy Thompson. It is most noticeable for the way that the immediately related species, anywhere from a sunfish and a porcupine fish, to baboons, chimpanzees, and humans, which are vastly different, all seem to evolve over a Cartesian grid in a mathematically precise, particular, and calculated manner. We don't know why. Everything along the chassis of many of his studied animals simply extends along a predictable mathematical equation, giving credence to the idea that there are almost evolutionary quote-unquote prerequisites that most organisms are slated to follow in all circumstances, and their scientific and mathematical precision is baffling. In other words, there is something inside of us, conscious inside of us, that knows how to evolve and has a tendency to do it very precisely. And over 105 years later, this phenomenon remains unexplained. What inside of us is this specific? What inside of us, from a prenatal and microscopic level, where all evolution is supposed to happen, knows all of this? Why does evolution here seem less random and more like it is a quote-unquote conscious decision? Perhaps, if we consider the panpsychist model, microscopic entities are conscious and grow increasingly conscious with each new metamorphosis. These phenomena potentially explain themselves. Building from the molecular, prenatal, and most fundamentally early stages, conscious behavior molds these creatures into what we know and understand and are baffled by today.